In many action games, outside of some knockback forces, playing with physics is seldom explored. This is understandable as the deeper one delves into physics gameplay, the more unpredictable an encounter can become, making it harder to both balance and account for bugs. But this unpredictability can also be a great strength in how it keeps the encounters fresh and engaging. There are lots of safe and easy ways to start adding physics without harming an action game's ecosystem. Projectiles or objects that fall or bounce, and ragdolling on death are common safe uses in games, and can be used as foundations for exploring more complex uses. I like to think of these as two separate categories, whole body and bone level physics, as each one has a widely different result. Whole body physics are frequently used in games with the player, enemies, projectiles, or objects as a whole being manipulated by forces. A majority of games get by with just this usage, and is commonly seen with moving, falling, jumping, knockbacks, and launchers. Some games explore this further, like Dark Messiah's environmental usage, Valve's gravity gun, rocket jumping, portal gun, or control with their levitation and destruction. And others like Just Cause or the newer Zelda games incentivize combining these physical interactions to be used in creative and unexpected ways. Bone level physics refers to the physics interactions affecting specific bones or individual segments of a character or object, rather than treating it as a single rigid entity. The most common use of this you might be familiar with is Ragdoll, which is frequently used to provide dynamic and interactive character reactions, usually upon death or knockout. A less common but more advanced approach is active Ragdoll, where bone level physics blend with existing gameplay and animation. Similar to methods in the previous procedural video, this allows characters to dynamically react and adapt to environmental surroundings. Games like Human Fall Flat or Gang Beasts, where you can pull parts of the body, or many physics-based sword fighters like Examina or Half Sword, utilize active ragdoll gameplay. With so many different forces and weights at play, it's easy for the character to look a bit limp and silly. Some games such as Mordhau or Overgrowth have achieved a much more serious result, and probably the most refined example is in Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption, which blends bone physics with procedural animation techniques to create lifelike and dynamic results. At their core, these approaches are all quite similar, and the key is in balancing the mass, forces, and blending behaviors to get the right feel. I think this works great especially for dynamic hit reactions and would scale well for different types of enemies and sizes. Probably the most requested change by far on the last video was the overly cartoony bounce jiggle the player had when landing and receiving hits. This is now replaced by a blend of animation and more specific bone chain knockback forces. Each attack in the game also has a launch power stat which, if strong enough, will trigger a ragdoll fall. I'm using F Impossible Creations Ragdoll Animator 2 plugin, which assists greatly with the fidelity here. Adjusting both muscle forces with a blended falling pose, the result is always dynamic with some very satisfying results. Both the environmental reactions and fall can also be triggered from objects and even other enemies, taking both their speed and weight into account. For further testing, I added some physics weapons such as a force impulse that will launch smaller enemies and objects, and even yourself. Another reason I wanted to implement Ragdoll was for a planned rope drag mechanic, which is a key area the physics play comes in. The rope drag works similar to the grapple in that it can attach to anything, but also physically interacts with the world. If the object cannot be pulled, it will anchor to that point, but if it is a physical object with a rigid body, it will attempt to drag that object. Luckily, the Ragdoll setup we have works seamlessly with this rope drag. If the enemy is weak enough, it will trigger the Ragdoll's fall and pull at the bone it's attached to. This feels awesome, and it's cool to see that it works so well, but there's still more fun to be had. While you could just retract your rope to release or throw your target, I also added the option to toss the other end and string together two objects. This allows you to set up environmental hazards or simply crowd control enemies, and similar to the drag, provides amazing results and fun. If charging the rope throw for a brief duration, it will shorten the rope upon hitting its target instead of maintaining its length. This allows for attaching objects to walls or propelling them directly to enemies. To make these objects more fun and interesting, I started experimenting with what I call behavior objects. Like their name suggests, these are objects which have a behavior attached to them, quite similar to something like Zonai devices in Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Each are quite simple on their own, usually having a single core function to carry out. They can often be toggled on or off, and this can be triggered through both ranged or melee attacks, or through a rope attachment. Rather than a combined vehicle focus games like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts had, I'm trying to think of them as more quick interactions that complement the movement and combat focus of the game, while still allowing for slower, thoughtful experimentation if you so choose. Each behavior object is also made with customizable settings, so for each type, you may find dozens of variations that greatly change your approach. For example, an explosive could explode instantly, on a delay, a countdown delay, require a strong physical impact or a specific damage trigger, have health, or change the explosive effect from damage to poison to a bounce impulse. Sometimes these may not even serve a rope attachment purpose and be static environmental interactions like a bounce pad or wind current. The current behavior objects are explosives, which as previously described have some sort of trigger for the explosive effect. Force emitters such as fans or rockets. These can emit force indefinitely, on timers, be locked to a specific plane, their weight which can also determine if they will be pulled or pull the object, and if they will explode on impact. Buzzsaws which follow the surface they're on, damaging objects in their path, and have options for slope limits and speeds. Impact objects which can be thrown or swung into enemies, something blunt may have more knockback whereas a spike ball may inflict more damage. Or situational ones like sticky surfaces. Projectile emitters, which can also share many standard trap behaviors, bullets, spikes going in and out, or streams of fire, water, or resin. As these explosives, impacts, and projectile emissions interact in many different, yet similar ways, I wanted to streamline the damage, forces, and projectile emission process so everything works in the same system. I restructured and simplified the code, so now both the player, enemy, and objects all share the same data and functions. This allows weapons, defenses, and hits to work across all types of entities, but does take more care when setting up the mass and other physical properties to ensure it works in every situation. Another big part this restructure has been leading to is boss physics. At the start of the video when I mentioned bone level ragdoll physics, this is the area I think it can be utilized very well. To refresh a bit, the active ragdoll allows blending between your animated pose and the forces on the ragdoll. Now imagine this scaled up to a colossal size. With the more extreme mass of a giant, you won't get as dramatic floppy movements, and it gives incredible feedback to the physics objects and the forces you throw at it. For hit scan weapons that don't have a physical collider for the ragdoll to interact with, we can apply a force to the bone hit, and since the mass of the creature scales with size, we don't need any extra calculations to scale the knockback. This also works quite well with the rope attachment, and you can pin down or drag specific limbs. This tactic's effectiveness will vary based on the size, but there is potential to stop a strike by pinning an arm or even briefly restraining a mid-sized foe. Each active rope has a target length, and if stretched too far will snap off, so this will determine the weight hierarchy when pinning and dragging objects and limbs. Alongside procedural elements from previous videos, this is part of a larger vision I have for extremely immersive colossal enemies, so for now this is just an early sneak peek. Some had also requested some Shadow of the Colossus style climbing on giants. I did briefly prototype this with some active ragdoll for the character, but ultimately I think I will scrap the idea as it doesn't feel like it has a place when you can maneuver so well with the grapple and hang off it anyway, as well as wall run or slide on enemies. Another request I had attempted but scrapped was a physical swing grapple rope. With how responsive it must be as the central game mechanic, there were a few issues I had. The interference was a bit jarring at times, especially in busy areas. Being high speeds and physical, it would decimate any destructibles in its path, and it was not as stable visually in certain frame rates. Despite this version not making it in, it did result in a new grapple that did. I really liked the look of a more physically simulated grapple, so kept that aspect of it and just took out the collision part. Instead of the old sine wave snap, it now shoots out a loose rope that tightens after attaching with some slack. This looks and feels immensely better and avoids all the issues I had with the collision one. And just to be clear, the rope drag and attach does still have collision, but it is a separate mechanic from the swing. Another cool unexpected outcome with the physical rope was the potential for a physics whip weapon. This is just using the Twin Blades attack animation and has no shortening or lengthening, but you can already see how it would have some interesting results. And once I start making new melee weapons, this is very likely to be in. And speaking of weapon swapping, I also made some early changes there as well. You can now bind weapons to 12 quick slots, which by default are bound to these keys on keyboard, and a radial menu on controller. A lot of work in this space also went into how gear and equipment works in general, and we'll soon be testing equipment that changes how certain mechanics work to customize your desired playstyle. Alongside these changes, the player controller in general went through a huge overhaul, with over 20k lines of code reworked, with many improvements and bugs fixed. Not only did the handling of movement, combat, and transition see improvement, but the physics handling as well to account for these new systems. For example, when you attach an object to a wall with a shortened rope, it's straining to pull that object in, and the force of your character is pushing against it. This could cause scenarios where the two forces would launch the character unexpectedly, but now it handles situations like this far more gracefully. There was also some work with some style tests, and a few new areas, a sky fortress above the clouds, and some cave and dungeon interiors. Since there are still some states, transitions, and forces in the works with the rope and Ragdoll, I don't think I will have a demo just yet for it, but do have a nice one planned. As I am transitioning from prototype to polish, I want the next demo to be focused on that goal. Through this year, I'll be making test rooms with a focus on certain aspects like combat, movement, behavior object testing, puzzles, or a combination of multiple. This will serve as great design feedback for the eventual polished Open Zone Steamfest demo, and should also be a fun experience for those itching to play more. The upcoming months will return to more combat and movement development, as well as advanced enemy combat AI, and later UI in preparation for this demo. Alongside my arm injury from the drunk driver accident, this rope, ragdoll, and codework was a lot of non-visual progress, and I had taken a break from social media posting while doing this work. Now that I'm transitioning back to familiar gameplay progress, I'll also be returning to posting more smaller frequent updates on social platforms. As I do, feel free to comment any behavior objects, enemies, or challenge rooms you would like to experience, and I look forward to this next phase of development. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to the patrons who helped greatly with Withersworn's development.